there are lots of questions, and I have this workflow chart that I made for different digital workflow that uses Lightroom to Photoshop. That's the left column. The middle one is Bridge, Adobe Camera Raw, and Photoshop. And then the very right one is the Bridge and Photoshop workflow. And depending on what kind of images that you're dealing with, who you are, designer versus a photographer, the workflow starts to change a bit. This you can access in the Blackboard, in my folder, your folder in Blackboard with the handout. But you can look at them and then see the Lightroom and Photoshop and the Bridge, Adobe Camera Raw, and Photoshop. Those two are a very similar approach that is based on the needs for photographers who shoot raw files. Whether you use Lightroom, or maybe you don't want to use Lightroom and skip that Lightroom part and bridge to Adobe Camera Raw. But those two are very similar workflows. And designer often gets the image from photographer that is already processed, so you don't have to go into Camera Raw to process it. So the very right one, Bridge and Photoshop, those are more like a designer's workflow that wouldn't require a raw processors. If not necessary, then, right? So these two. And the middle workflow is the one that I just showed you. And this class is not about Lightroom, but more centered around Photoshop. So this workflow is the one that I'm showing you. But if you have a understanding in Lightroom, then Lightroom to Photoshop workflow probably will make sense to you more so. And that is what I do, the Lightroom to Photoshop the workflow. So this, both Paul and Cristin knows about this workflow cheat sheet, and then they're saying maybe you can take a look at it and then see if that would organize your thoughts and maybe questions too. Okay, this you can find it in the Blackboard, and if you go to assignments, Photoshop Classroom in the book, no, course handouts, that's really course handouts, and then in the course handouts you see a digital workflow overview, and you can see this one. So take a look at them and then see if you have questions. But what is happening in this classroom, if you use and if you shoot raw files, is the middle workflow. But if you are already familiar with Lightroom, then you can already import it into Lightroom. And then if you like to bring in images from Lightroom to Photoshop, then you can do that, by the way, directly from Lightroom by selecting the image that you like to bring in, and right-click on the image and edit in, and you can bring in the file, open a file in Photoshop from Lightroom in this way. When you do this, there is one more place that you should look into. I'm probably looking into that one a little bit too much, but let me just go to Lightroom Preferences. And under Preferences, there is a External Editing. All you need to do is to really pay attention to this part. How do you want the Lightroom to bring your images into Photoshop? From the previous conversation that we all know, once raw file is processed and go into Photoshop, it needs to be converted to somewhat the workable formats that recognizes layers and masks and so on, which is TIFF or Photoshop format. I should tell you either or would work, TIFF or Photoshop format. Color space. There are different color spaces. Photo RGB is the largest color space that I would prefer to work on if you are raw shooter, shooting raw. We know bit depths. When it comes to bit depths, more the better. Resolution. This wouldn't change the file size. It's just allocate number of pixels in 1 inch based on the existing pixel numbers. You can go 240 or 300, either or. That doesn't make any differences in file size. Either or, yeah. And compression, I would say none. And this only asks when you are choosing TIFF format as a external editing format. If you choose PSD, it even won't ask you. So if you like to make things simpler, PSD format would work okay. So that is the settings in Preferences of how Lightroom brings your file into Photoshop. It's going to be PSD format, color space is going to be Photo RGB, bit depth 16-bit, and resolution 240. I will talk more about the color space next week. And let me go back to Photoshop. Not the ducky, but this one. And I'm going to bring back my Camera Raw, Adobe Camera Raw processing window. I'm back in Photoshop, Adobe Camera Raw processing window, and at the bottom there is a workflow settings window. I'm going to click onto that. It brings you workflow options. Basically, this window is very similar to the window that the preference settings that we set in Lightroom. It asks you what color space. If you are using raw file, I would go for the largest color space per photo RGB. What kind of bit depths? I would like it 16-bit. More is better. If you like to resize it, which I probably wouldn't here, but if you like to resize it, you can make it smaller even. But I'll keep the original file size. And you can set the resolution of either 300 or earlier. In Lightroom, I set it to 240. The output sharpening, I'm going to keep it off. you can check this output sharpening if you are not going to do any further adjustment in Photoshop. But if you plan to do anything in Photoshop, then I would do an output sharpening later. Then you can open this file as a smart object and say OK. So this work options that you can find from the bottom of the Adobe Camera Raw processor in Photoshop is the same settings or very similar settings to what you can find in Lightroom Preference, this one. So you can start to see the connection between the two. If you like to open the image from Lightroom in Photoshop, you can go Edit In, and you can go to Edit in Adobe Photoshop CC 2018. If any adjustment is applied in Develop module, you go Edit a copy with Lightroom adjustments and open it, and that would open in Photoshop. I think it's opening, hopefully. Yep. So it opens in Photoshop. Now, I'm going to make adjustment. I'm going to make it to black and white. And once I make an adjustment in Photoshop, I can go ahead and save this. Just simply file and save. I don't have to go save as. I'm going to save this. And as soon as I save it and go back to Lightroom, the image that I opened in Photoshop is back in Lightroom. So it's the total workflow from Lightroom to Photoshop. Now, say I would like to adjust this again and make it not black and white, or partially black and white, but partially color. So I would like to reopen this picture in Photoshop. I'll try that. First, I'm going to close this picture and then go back to Lightroom. Right-click, Edit in Adobe Photoshop CC 2018. Now, I get the same adjustment, the same window prompting how do I want to open my file in Photoshop. This time, if I go into Edit a Copy with Lightroom Adjustments, if I select that adjustment, I would get rid of the layers that I created in Photoshop. I would like to go either edit a copy of the Photoshop version of my file or edit original, which refers to my Photoshop version file. Either one of these ones to make sure that I still have layers. Say if I make a mistake and if I go to edit a copy with Lightroom adjustments and edit it, it opens in Photoshop without layers, and that black and whiteness, I can't readjust it anymore because it's in one layer. I can't adjust it. That's not what I want because this is distractive editing. I'll close this, don't save. And then I go back to Lightroom, right-click, Edit in Adobe Photoshop CC 2018, edit original of the Photoshop file that I have layers. I will say edit. Now I still have layers. I still have layers. And say I would like to make this one area of the picture in color.
What is the difference between original and copy if you open one or another?
If it is copy, then it creates another copy of the original. And then say if you like to have certain areas in color, I'm going to just do a really quick job. In black and white, I can reveal part of the picture underneath this black and white layer to show the color part, but other part is black and white. I can even feather it so that the edge of the mask is not so obvious. And I can save this. I save this one by going to File and then Save. And it goes back to Lightroom. Now I have a version updated that has partially color. So that is the workflow from Lightroom to Photoshop. Now if you want to only use bridging in Photoshop, you can do the similar things, but with skip that Lightroom part to make a catalog basically. Okay. So a few things that I would like to give you an emphasis on is this. In the Camera Raw, settings underneath here, the workflow settings to specify a bit depth and the resolution, color space, that would be something that is very important. So if you happen to use the Adobe Camera Raw, make sure to visit this bottom part and look at the workflow settings. Make sure that you're getting a maximum bit depth, 16-bit, and then also the largest color space, which is a Profoto RGB. You can convert this one later on if you like to, but to take advantage of raw file, you can have the color space that is largest available up there. And say OK too. Okay. Other details, you can look through the lessons and then see all the tools that is available in Adobe Camera Raw windows, which is really basically the same as the bullet module in Lightroom. Okay. Questions?